Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Telco Drift. For those that haven't met yet, I'm Pablo, sort of an independent industry analyst, and in today's episode, I'm joined by Carlos Perea to chat about innovative tech in emerging market. Carlos, welcome to the Telco Drift.
Thank you, Pablo, and it's actually a pleasure to be here and a pleasure to be, sharing some ideas and potentially, some good conversations around what is going on in the emerging markets from my perspective. And honored to be here with your audience. Thank you. Thank you for the invitation.
Okay, amazing. It's like good to have another guest on the show after me, chatting a bit of nonsense for a couple of episodes. So, just before we get into the emerging market stuff, so I know you're an investor and advisor in the technology sphere. So, can you just share a little bit more about your background and sort of your story before then we start moving on the content itself?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So, I started over my career about 35 years ago in Mexico City in the U.S. with AT&T. I was leading basically at that time what it was the new expansion of the telecom industry in the 90s, when the international expansion for companies and manufacturing and exportation was going on. So I was leading basically all the U.S. multinationals and then later global accounts, global multinationals expanding into Mexico and Latin America. And I moved to 3Com then, leading all the expansion also for them in the late 90s. And I started up also the operations for Extreme Networks. Probably some of you may remember Extreme Networks, which is doing actually very well recently. They were the networking company that was the challenger in gigabit Ethernet and 10 gigabit Ethernet back then, at the time in the late 90s and early 2000s. I led the operation from Mexico across all Latin America, growing basically from 0 customers to $100 million in 15 years. I was actually leading that until 2015. Then I moved to Gigamon Corporation, also starting up the operations for networking visibility, and then later on what it became the cybersecurity engine for visibility networks and visibility operations in the core of the network. So it was a really nice project. We started up operations in Brazil, in Mexico, all across Latin America. I lived several years in Brazil as well, and then from there we moved to Infovista, also launching something that they were doing, and they were making something very interesting. They were coming over from a separation and spin-off of Orange Networks at the time. They were integrating something that was called Ipanema Networks, that was eventually sold to Extreme Networks as well, for SD-WAN solutions. It was very interesting. And then I helped them out to relaunch all the operations across Latin America, and it was very successful at the time. Before I moved with at the time the chief revenue officer that moved into Cradlepoint, and I helped them out as well to design the entire operation and the due diligence for marketing and international expansion across Latin America in terms of which countries, which markets, how do they do the export and the expansion for specific countries like Mexico, Brazil, Colombia, and so on. So it's been a full career, I would say, in tech. Very focused on international expansion. Very focused on growth and technology, connectivity, networking, cybersecurity. And recently, I have been more on the advisory side and investment side across different geographies, and also with different funds of investments that I am leading with my family office that I'm leading from several years ago in the market. We have investment in companies like Anthropic, for example, or companies like recently like Klarna. We have been doing in private investment in different other companies that have been public successfully recently. And right now, some advisory to tech companies that are willing to merge and leverage what they do in terms of connectivity, as well as full stack design and full stack development in terms of solution for the end user. And my expertise is essentially integrating the technology into the business model for international expansion. That's what I do.
I mean, I can summarize this. You've been quite busy over the last few years with quite a few nice projects. And yeah, it seems like you're the right person to talk about, bringing that technology and expanding it into emerging market, which we know are a completely different beast compared to, what you would find in the more mature markets and environments. But when we start thinking about emerging markets, probably 6G is not the first thing that comes to mind. But there was just a big announcement from Nvidia and Nokia about effectively Nvidia pouring like a good chunk of money into Nokia. Again, a bit of a segue, but what are your thoughts on this? How important do you see this developing, for the future of the telco market?
Yeah. Well, first I will say, like, I was genuinely very impressed about the announcement. Uh, Very pleased actually to see that finally there is some element that is bringing back the telecom industry into the game. The telecom industry for several years already has been, I would probably say, in the back seat in many markets because of the lack of focus onto the needs and the customer, the needs of the market, and the needs on the application layer that can actually deliver value for customers. The integration of a company like Nvidia, for example, into the stack of the solution is more of bringing alive the network, not just pure connectivity, but also intelligence into the connections and also intelligence into the applications that the eventual users are going to be having, leveraging the connectivity that is abroad in different countries. And Nokia is the perfect candidate because they are to our topic here is that they are basically the leaders in the enterprise market, and the enterprise is actually the number one consumer of artificial intelligence right now in
Mhm.
many ways. And also at the same time, I see that the accessibility that Nokia will have with new technologies that is practically impossible to develop by themselves in the short term is going to be delivering a quantum leap into the solution pack that they're going to be facing with this type of customers eventually in the long run. And also for Nvidia, I believe is the perfect pathway for having access into the direct end user level at a global scale in a very very quick fashion for delivering these type of solutions. So I see it's a win-win for both of them,
Mhm.
but moreover, what I see is essentially a quantum leap into the industry that is going to be within the next 5 to 10 years changing the way we see telecom and changing the way we experience networks basically and services across the board.
And it's good to hear. I mean, you're very positive on the development, and I think it's an interesting one because there have been some talk about AI run for some times, but this is like a clear show of intent, right? Clear commitments. We do see that opportunity to be playing in the field, and probably something that our telco friends will be able to start thinking about and strategize and think, okay, what can we really do next? But if I'm bringing this into a more emerging market type of scenario, do you expect such a development or sort of that broader AI play to potentially democratize the adoption of new tech in emerging markets? Do you think that that is also something that we can expect, or is still going to be more on the mature market side of things?
Well, that's a very good question, Pablo, because it brings me back into the topic of why 5G hasn't been successful in emerging markets yet. And the
Mhm.
reason why is because of what we were describing before. The focus of the service providers as well as the technology vendors on 5G has a lot of heavy lifting to do before delivering the services to the end user. What I mean by that is the technology is not yet democratic for anyone. That's a reality. 6G is far, far, far away for many. To be honest with you, right now, I mean, in terms of technology, what we're seeing as a possibility for 5G in different countries in emerging markets is probably 5 to 10 years far away of what is reality right now in the
Mm.
market for them. If we think about 6G for them, it's just probably 15 or more, or maybe even never will arrive.
Yeah,
And
maybe sci-fi at the moment where 6G will land in emerging markets, but good to dream.
yeah, exactly. And in my view, and in my experience, what I believe is LTE connected people when it came. 5G is basically designed for connecting industries, and 5G standalone, which is going a little bit into the topic, is where industries get powerful and empowered by the technology. And in general, the infrastructure is technology for economic transformation, and not all economies are actually ready to be transformed. Many of these economies in emerging markets are still struggling in different ways on the basics. So what I see is there is still a lot of regulation to happen around the technology adoption for before being democratized. It has to be allowed by the governments, and many governments don't really understand that they can actually be transformed with this type of technology because they have another priorities and they have other needs in the plate right now going on.
I mean, this becomes a bit different conversation, but and a bit off topic probably. But it doesn't make sense that probably the technology agenda is still detached from the political agenda in emerging market. Is that a fair assumption? Because if I'm thinking a more mature market like the US, you can see how the technology agenda now is embedded in the political agenda and how everything needs to be going that direction. You can claim the same things for China, right? So is that politics hasn't reached a stage yet where they see, okay, tech is gonna be like a key pillar for us in driving our own reaching our own objective.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the political understanding of the capacity of the technology is still not yet developed fully in many different countries. I would say there is a lot of room for education at a political level of what can be possible for the countries to leverage throughout the usage of technology if they allow the technology to be basically part of their political agenda as well as the political uh, speech as well as the strategy for the country for the next 5 to 10 to 15, 20 years. Very few countries I have seen making that quantum leap. Those who can actually understand the adoption of technology as an enabler of their development are the ones who are actually making a difference, and usually are those countries who are a little bit smaller and more focused on the value for their citizens and the value for their companies that are actually being attracted into the country compared to those who have the power to be the needle movers. I'm talking about let's aside of course US, China, UK, and a few other handful of countries in Europe, and several others in Asia. We have a lot of countries, let's say in emerging markets, where they have the appetite to go after the technology and develop solutions and killer applications leveraging at least LTE or 5G non-standalone. But the regulation is basically limiting the growth and limiting the possibilities for them to actually grow in terms of technology and the deployment that they can actually deliver and do. Good example for instances, in Latin America we have two behemoths of economies. We have Brazil from one side and we have Mexico on the other side. So Mexico is still struggling in terms of the technology agenda, and is actually going backwards instead of going forward in terms of the technology and telecommunications, what they are doing right now recently. I mean, they close out the Federal Institute of Telecommunications. They got rid of the 5G tender and so on. Whereas Brazil has been doing an amazing job in defining, for example, public usage of broadband access for private networks, and they also have 5G standalone in specific cities, and they have 5G already for different applications. Fintech, for example, is a huge business transformation strategy for the country, and is basically leveraging the connectivity capabilities that the network in three or four different carriers have in the country. And this is speaking about the same region. This is Latin
Mm-hmm.
America. If we go the same in different countries like in Africa or in Southeast Asia, or even some pockets of Europe, we see something similar in different countries where the technology is there, the solution is actually there. The industrial level connectivity that is available to make with the technology available right now is amazing. Just
Mhm.
even thinking about LTE. But if we
Yeah.
think about the other possibilities for them, can make a huge change of how the country can actually develop in a shorter amount of time. But it depends mainly on the political agenda that they will have.
That's interesting because again, tech is always there. Like a lot of this conversation, the tech is there, and then everything around it is difficult to grasp. But a quick follow up: is the red compartida still a thing in Mexico, or
Well,
is it
that's
a thing anymore? Because I remember back in the days I used to cover Mexico, and I love the idea of that red compartida and what it was supposed to be doing. I haven't followed much recently, so I'm not even sure it's still there. Do you have any updates on that?
yeah, yeah, and I think and you're nailing it. I mean the concept of Altan, which is the red compartida, and is something that was innovative at the time, and I believe it was a very good idea for just exactly speaking about the democratization of connectivity and
Mm-hmm.
opening the network for different layers of the social grid in the country, as well as giving access to to people who never have had connectivity whatsoever of any kind. Uh, from its inception, I think the concept is very good. From the development standpoint, I think it has been having some sort of evolution, and especially recently, where Altan is basically now part of CFE Telecom, and CFE Telecom is basically part of the federal government,
Mm-hmm.
and now you have basically the same player that can actually deliver services through a bunch of MVNOs, which is really interesting, but they have limited access into LTE only. They don't have anything related to 5G. And at the same time, CFE is becoming another telecom player into the market that is competing with incumbents. So this is good and bad. I mean, it's good because it creates pressure into the incumbent in the market, which is basically Carso Group and
Yeah.
all the companies that
Which
they
is a
have.
big incumbent. I remember back in the
It is.
days, it was a proper definition of incumbent.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And they are doing amazing. I mean, to be honest with you, they do really well in terms of operation. They do really well in terms of delivering services, but at the same time, they don't have urgency to become, a huge differentiator in terms of innovation in 5G
Mm-hmm.
or standalone 5G, or or even not even think about 6G, for example. But those kind of pressures that they put through Red Compartida, Altan, and the network, and all the MVNOs is really good for the market if they can be kept in the in the isolation and separation of the market. Now they are part of the government. The game is different, and now the game is basically you have CFE Telecom and then Altan as part of the same game, and then you have the big incumbent and a bunch of others.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't see that as a benefit for the country in terms of digitization and evolution where they actually need to be.
So let's call it sort of a half good, glass half full type of
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
development. So
exactly. Yeah,
it's
I mean,
it's good to see, like something different, right? That is, I think, a little bit more suited to local dynamics.
yeah,
Because that made sense back in the days. And probably thinking about local dynamics. So when we're thinking about bringing new tech in emerging market, do you think that there needs to be a local ecosystem that is really capable of taking that technology, what is like 5G, AI, whatever you want, and that is adapting it to the local environment? Because that could be, I imagine, quite a big roadblock if you don't have the effectively the resources and the structure to have the ecosystem in place. Do you think that is essential and that potentially one of the reasons why some tech may struggle in emerging markets?
yeah. That's a brilliant question because I have been recently advising a couple of companies that are doing investment in the telecom side in some of these emerging markets, and definitely there are two elements that are key for being successful in those. One is the element of understanding the local regulation so that
Mhm.
they can actually know where the boundaries within the market and the government willingness to stretch those boundaries towards the usage of the technology. And you cannot have that without a local partner. That's one thing. The other thing, which is the other side of the coin, is basically the ecosystem that is going to be leveraging the connectivity layer with services and applications that can actually, explode all these platforms of technology and the bandwidth they can have, and the resilience that they can have, and the immediately, accessibility that they can actually have. If the ecosystem is not well grounded in local partnerships, so you
Mhm.
really need to have that in the country that you want to land. Those two elements, in my mind, are some of the most important, and the choice of the partner is actually very, very important, because it can be from local, operators that are probably the challengers in the market, to new entrepreneurs that are coming from different areas of technology that require the connectivity layer as one of the enablers for the solution delivery, so that they can actually have a fresh look into the market instead
Mhm.
of coming from the traditional core and edge mindset that we have seen in many different businesses.
And slightly connected to this, but slightly a little bit further off. So Telefonica has been leaving most of its Latin American markets, right? So
Mhm.
they've been selling off, I think, Colombia, Ecuador, Argentina. They're in the process of selling pretty much everything except Brazil. How
Mhm.
do you see that from, again, bringing new tech? Is that an opportunity? I think quite a few were acquired by Millicom, if I'm
Mhm.
correct. So you think that as a positive because it's sort of a bit of a hungrier company, if you want, to develop in the region compared to Telefonica, probably after a while was not that committed, or the fact that it's a smaller companies will still present other challenges.
Well, this is interesting because the what is happening with Telephonic after probably good 20 years of try and true in the market. They did, I would say, quite decently in different markets. First with fixed line access, and then later with mobile, and then they were trying very hard in countries like Chile, Peru, Argentina. They were doing very well in Colombia, for example. It was a little bit harder because of the conditions of the market there. In Mexico, they, a couple years ago, I think, or a little more, they decided to sell all, the concessions of the spectrum to AT&T, and then they became basically an MVNO, which was also, in my mind, a very good decision for them. But on the other hand, we go back to Brazil, and in Brazil we have Telefonica Vivo, which is
Yeah.
a huge player in the market, doing things really, really nicely, really well, and delivering a huge value there. Once again, the baseline of their success is basically the regulatory environment that they have,
Hmm.
of the market size, but the regulatory environment is allowing them to be successful with the economics that they have in the operation. All of the countries, despite the appetite of Telefonica being successful at a regional level, uh, are quite different, because Latin America for many is a single country. In reality, is a collection of more than 50 countries that you have different stakeholders, different players, different laws, different regulations, different rules of the game. Sometimes even different accents and way to communicate. So it is different, and it's challenging for a company like Telefonica. I believe the decision is good for them. I believe the acquirers like Millicom, for example, who is actually playing into the geography expansion and doing it
Hmm.
really well. They deliver the type of solution in the bracket of the consumer that they are actually targeting, leveraging the spectrum that they already have access from that acquisition, different of what they are doing in countries like Spain and some others in Europe, or in Brazil in particular, where they have the consumer level, and then they have also a bracket for enterprise business, which is very lucrative because they actually can deliver value based on what they
Hmm.
have.
So it seems that Brazil is definitely a good example for people to keep in mind in terms of regulatory environment. But so you mentioned Brazil, you mentioned Vivo, and sort of, favorite technology of everyone is private 5G, and Vivo has been, deploying few private 5G networks, quite a few years back in the mining space. So my question for you is that do you see private 5G as potentially being sort of a cheat code of starting bringing that more advanced connectivity, that more forward-looking technology into this market? Is that possible? And I'm asking it in a moment where private 5G is not going through a particularly rosy time in terms of hype and people being happy with how the market is developing.
Hmm. Yeah, I think you know private cellular networks in general have been there for quite some time already. Starting with 4G LTE in some places, but because of the nature of 5G, as I mentioned before, LTE was designed to connect people, and 5G was designed to connect industries. Uh, Natively, 5G should be the platform for adoption in connectivity for these companies in terms of segments, specific applications, and there are a bunch of use cases that can be mentioned here. But the reality is that still a challenge for many of the companies to be uh, adopting at scale the private cellular network play. And what I mean for that is that let's think about a little bit of the number of companies that have been deploying private cellular networks or private 5G, and we have so far probably no more than 500 networks in 5G so far, and these are networks that are like really pricey, really challenging to deploy, because you still need to think about a private cellular network as if you were like a mini service provider. This is where the challenge is for many of these industries. The success that I have seen more, expanding more rapidly is in mining, logistics, probably ports, also some sort of manufacturing. Essentially all those large scale spaces where you need to have uh, predictable and reliable connectivity, where Wi-Fi is not available, where fiber optic is not enough, where LAN solutions is also limited. So those are basically the ones where the market is actually starting to be growing. That said, um, the other part of the conversation is where is this kind of technology available for being deployed. And as I mentioned earlier, it starts with the regulation. In
Mm-hmm.
many of the emerging markets, especially in Latin America, many of these emerging markets, they don't even have any kind of regulation for the use of private spectrum, private cellular spectrum. I mean, we have CBRS in the US, which is really,
Yeah.
really good, and is proving to be very successful, especially in manufacturing. They're doing really well. But then you have, except for Brazil again, who has the industrial spectrum layer,
Yeah.
where they have been doing and deploying some of these networks. They're doing really well. But you have, for example, the mining industry in Australia, and the mining industry in South America, like countries like Chile or Argentina or Peru. Uh, it is usually a matter of making a 1 year lobbying due diligence with the government so that they can actually have access to the spectrum, and then the next year is basically doing all the deployment or the procurement of the
Mm-hmm.
network, and then another year for the deployment. When it happens, 3 years have passed, so the technology is already no longer you know really leveraging the help that it needs to be delivering for those
Mm-hmm.
markets. So it is a challenge. I think the way yet again the governments are approaching the potential use of private cellular networks is very limited in terms of the capacity that it can be delivered. And this is why companies like Nokia, for example, is being very successful in this market, because what they have done very well is they have been partnering with companies locally in the local ecosystem who have actually access to that spectrum pre-approved in some cases, that they
Mhm.
can actually deploy the private cellular networks in a very quick fashion compared to the standard process. And this is also one of the reasons why some of the service providers, and this is very funny and interesting at the same time, service providers are starting to pitch private cellular networks for the industry, when the industry, what they want to do is basically be independent of the service provider using private cellular networks. So it is kind of like a catch 22 in that kind. But from the other hand, there are several, let's say, managed service providers or emerging market, solution providers that can actually leverage connectivity as private cellular network
Mhm.
to put on top of that their capacity layer in terms of the development stack of the solution they deliver.
There's definitely a broader trend that I've seen in terms of broadening the definition of what a private network is, and telcos are at the center of it, pushing it away from what some would normally define as a private network. So definitely interesting to see that. And the other quick point, so you mentioned CBRS, and I thought CBRS is a great development, and hopefully I'm going to be able to get someone to chat about CBRS in another episode. I do think CBRS is in a bit of a sort of tricky situation right now, sort of live or die situation, because we know that certain actors are lobbying to get the spectrum used differently, and I think that's going to be like a big battle for private networks. But that's for another story.
Yeah.
Maybe very last question from for you, and it's like a broader one. So based on your experience, if there is one single thing that people who are trying to push innovative tech in emerging market they should avoid, was that mistake that people should really avoid that?
Wow, that's a big one and a difficult one, because I'm immediately thinking about not just one but several. But I think, I believe when you think about it going into international expansion to emerging markets, the most important piece that you really need to have on hand is who is going to be representing you. You need to know who is the person who is going to be carrying your flag, wearing your T-shirt, and actually, representing your ethos, representing your philosophy, your values, and your
Mhm.
solution, and your business concept and business idea. This is probably the most important part of what you need to do. Now, what you don't need to do is, you as an entrepreneur or as an investor or as a company that is going to these markets, you need to avoid the those who are selling mirrors. There are a lot of those in these markets, unfortunately, and and many of these people basically they say that they have the connection. Many years ago they were calling, I have the Rolodex. Now you have your LinkedIn, but
Mhm.
it's, but it's very interesting because they claim that they have access to many contacts and people and so on, but at the same time, the the reality is what we are just talking about right now. When you are going into an emerging market, deploying a private cellular network there, either through an ecosystem partner or through a developer or to a solution provider that can actually deliver that, the first thing you need to know is that if your person in representation has actually access to where the regulatory environment is and
Mhm.
how to understand that regulatory and the capabilities and boundaries of that regulatory environment. Otherwise, it becomes very challenging. And even though when you understand that, now the point is on the other side, and I'm extending a little bit more here because I have seen that in several companies. The company needs to know if they have the appetite to be flexible and adaptive into what
Mhm.
the emerging market requires. Because not all the companies are actually made the same DNA in terms of adaptation and flexibility. There may be a huge market opportunity if you are flexible enough,
Mhm.
but if you're not, is recipe for dying in the market.
That's very interesting, and I imagine with a lot of companies, the idea is always scalability and replicability. But the reality is that you need to keep in mind that everything is not the same.
Yeah.
Every country and everything is always going to be much harder than people think. But Carlos, thank you very much. Really appreciate your time. Great conversation, and thanks again for being with me on the Tech Drift.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here, Pablo. Thank you so much for inviting me, and hope we have more conversations like this.